My name is Emily, and I am 32 years old. I am a mother to a beautiful 6-year-old boy named Noah. Until just a few short days ago, I was also a wife, building a quiet, ordinary life with my husband Mark. But life changes in a single heartbeat, and now I am a widow navigating the darkest week of my entire existence. The morning light filtering through the kitchen window felt far too bright for a house wrapped in deep mourning. I stood at the kitchen island staring down at a cooling cup of coffee that I had poured over an hour ago. The steam was completely gone, and the dark liquid reflected my own pale, exhausted face. I had slept perhaps 3 hours, tossing and turning constantly, reaching out for Mark in the cold, empty space of our large bed. But Mark was gone, and the heavy reality of it still felt like a physical blow to my chest. It was a sudden sharp ache that stole my breath every single time I remembered he was never coming back. Yet there was no time to sit, and absolutely no time to cry. My house was already buzzing, filled with the chaotic, stressful energy of arriving relatives. The days leading up to the memorial service had quickly become a dizzying blur of catered food deliveries, floral arrangements and hushed conversations that stopped the exact moment I entered a room. Footsteps tapped sharply against the hardwood floor of the hallway. Martha, the stern mother of my late husband, swept into the kitchen. She carried a thick notepad and an air of absolute, unquestionable authority. She did not even look at me, but rather surveyed the clean countertops with a highly critical eye. "This needs to be cleared away before the expensive florist gets here," Martha instructed loudly. She waved a manicured hand toward a small stack of children colouring books. "I cannot have the house looking like a messy, disorganised playroom, Emily, especially when the important guests arrive." I swallowed the thick, painful lump in my throat and nodded slowly. "I will move them right now, Martha," I said quietly. I gathered the scattered crayons, the bright, playful colours feeling so jarring against the heavy, sombre mood of the entire house. Noah, my sweet little boy, had been colouring at the island, trying desperately to stay close to me. He was sensing the massive, frightening shift in our world. He was only 6 years old, much too young to fully grasp the cold permanence of death, but definitely old enough to feel the deep, unsettling absence of his father. Martha picked up my cold coffee mug and poured it down the sink without even asking if I was finished. "We need the counter space," Martha stated bluntly, turning on the faucet to rinse the fine porcelain clean. "And we need to finalise the seating arrangements for the large reception today. I have officially decided to put your sister at the back table, sitting with the younger rowdy cousins. The front tables are strictly reserved for immediate family and the senior respected colleagues from the firm Mark worked for." I gripped the smooth edge of the marble counter. I felt a familiar, suffocating tightness building rapidly in my chest. "But Sarah is my only sister," I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly in the quiet room. "I really need her close to me today. I need her emotional support." Martha stopped wiping the counter, turned slowly and finally looked at me. Her expression was not one of gentle sympathy, but of impatient, weary tolerance. "Emily, dear," Martha sighed deeply, as if she were explaining a simple concept to a very slow, stubborn child. "This event is about honouring my son and his important legacy. His wealthy business partners and our close, distinguished family friends expect a certain high level of decorum. Your sister, bless her simple heart, is lovely, but she is certainly not a core part of his professional world. We must prioritise the important people who matter most to his reputation." I looked down at my shaking hands. The plain gold band on my left ring finger caught the harsh, unforgiving overhead light. I wanted to argue with her so desperately. I wanted to scream loudly that I was his wife, that this was our shared home, and that my deep grief was just as valid as anyone else in this incredibly crowded house. But I bit the soft inside of my cheek, tasting the faint metallic tang of blood. Fighting with Martha right now would only create a terrible, ugly scene, and Mark had always hated loud scenes. He had always been the gentle buffer, the one who could smoothly steer his demanding mother away with a charming smile and a calming, sweet word. Now that vital buffer was completely gone, and I was left standing on the dangerous front lines, utterly alone and unprotected. "Okay," I whispered softly, staring blankly at the dark wooden floor. "Put her at the back table." The grueling morning dragged on, slowly turning into a punishing marathon of empty social pleasantries and exhausting logistical demands. Richard, the imposing father of my husband, sat heavily in the large living room chair. He simply expected a steady, uninterrupted flow of fresh, hot tea and quiet, respectful sympathy from everyone who passed by his comfortable seat. He did not once offer to help me, and he did not even ask how I was holding up. He simply sat there, a stern, silent, brooding presence, radiating a heavy, unspoken judgment over the entire house. I ran back and forth, feeling exactly like an invisible ghost in my own home. I organised the dry cleaning for the burial suit I coordinated endlessly with the busy caterer, and I constantly tried to keep the living spaces perfectly pristine. Every single time I tried to sit down, a new task was thrust upon me. I found myself standing in the narrow hallway, holding a stack of clean towels for the guest bathroom, when a sudden heavy wave of dizziness hit me. I leaned heavily against the cool painted wall, closing my tired, burning eyes and pressing my forehead against the smooth plaster. My entire body ached with a profound, exhausting sadness. My shoulders were knotted with deep, painful tension, and my heart beat with a dull, erratic thud. I missed Mark so much, it felt like I was physically dying too. I just wanted to find my young son crawl into my dark, quiet bed and pull the heavy covers over our heads until the harsh world disappeared entirely. But a sudden loud crash from the living room shattered my fragile moment of peace. I dropped the clean towels on a small wooden chair and hurried quickly down the hall. My heart raced, fearing Noah had hurt himself. When I turned the corner, I saw my sweet 6-year-old boy standing frozen near the large fireplace. He had accidentally knocked over a tall, decorative vase while trying to reach a small toy car he had left on the mantel yesterday. The heavy porcelain was broken into large, jagged pieces across the expensive rug. Noah was trembling slightly, his big brown eyes filling with immediate, terrified tears. Before I could even reach him, Martha was there. She marched into the centre of the room, her face tight with cold, unfiltered anger. "Look at what you have done," Martha scolded sharply, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet, tense house. "You are a clumsy, unruly child, Noah. This is exactly why children do not belong in formal adult spaces." Noah let out a soft, heartbreaking sob and tried to step backward away from her harsh, accusing glare. I rushed forward and dropped to my knees right on the edge of the broken porcelain. I wrapped my shaking arms tightly around his small, trembling body, pulling his face into my shoulder. "It is okay, sweetie," I whispered softly into his hair. "It was just a simple accident, do not cry." Martha let out a long, dramatic sigh of pure disgust. "It is not just an accident, Emily," Martha snapped, turning her cold, judgmental eyes directly onto me. "It is a direct result of your incredibly weak, permissive parenting. Mark always let you coddle the boy, and now look at the absolute disaster you have created. He lacks any basic discipline or simple respect for his elders. You need to control him, especially today when important people are grieving my son." For the past 10 years, I knew exactly what my role was in this exact type of situation. The script was burned into my tired brain. I was supposed to immediately lower my head, apologize profusely for my terrible failure, and promise to do much better. I was supposed to quickly clean up the heavy mess, soothe my angry mother-in-law, and then carry my crying child away to hide in a back room so we would not bother anyone else. I was the emotional sponge constantly absorbing their sharp, cruel edges so the rest of the family could feel comfortable and perfectly content. But as I knelt there on the floor holding my sobbing, fatherless child, something deep inside of me finally snapped. It was not a loud, violent break. It was a quiet, very still and profound realization. I looked up at Martha. I saw the deep lines of bitterness around her mouth and the complete lack of empathy in her cold, rigid posture. She did not see a grieving, heartbroken grandchild. She only saw an annoying, inconvenient mess that ruined her perfect, curated image. I realized in that very moment that no amount of apologies would ever make her love me. No amount of perfect hosting would ever make her respect me. I had spent a decade twisting myself into a tight, miserable knot, trying to be the perfect, accommodating wife for a family that viewed me as nothing more than a temporary, unpaid servant. And now, they were demanding that my traumatized son hide his perfectly normal grief to make their day easier. I took a slow, deep breath. The chaotic noise of the busy house seemed to fade away entirely. The heavy, crushing burden I had carried for years suddenly felt utterly pointless. I made a very quiet, very firm decision. I was done. I was completely, absolutely done being their emotional buffer. I slowly stood up, keeping one protective hand firmly on Noah. I did not yell and I did not cry. I looked Martha straight in the eyes, my expression completely flat and devoid of any apology. "Noah is grieving his father, Martha," I said evenly, my voice calm and surprisingly steady. "He is 6 years old and he is allowed to cry in his own home." Martha opened her mouth, clearly shocked by my sudden, unexpected defiance. She took a step forward, her face turning a deep, angry shade of red. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she sputtered angrily. I did not wait for her to finish her cruel sentence. I did not bend down to pick up the broken pieces of the ugly vase. I simply turned my back on her. "Come on, Noah," I said softly, taking his small, warm hand in mine. "Let us go to the kitchen and get you a glass of water." I walked away, leaving Martha standing completely alone, staring at the broken mess on the floor. I did not look back. For the first time in 10 years, I did not care if she was upset. I did not care if the house was messy or if the important guests were offended. I had dropped the heavy, invisible rope. The quiet, desperate struggle to keep their perfect world together was officially over. If they wanted to maintain the flawless, polished illusion of a happy family, they were going to have to do the heavy lifting themselves. I was only going to protect my son. The first guests began to arrive just before noon, their cars lining the long suburban street outside our home. Usually I would be standing right at the front door, wearing a perfectly pressed dark dress and a polite, welcoming smile. I would be taking heavy winter coats, directing people toward the quiet living room and making sure everyone had a small plate of catered food within 5 minutes of stepping inside. I would constantly check on Richard, bringing him his hot tea, and I would hover near Martha, ready to run whatever petty errand she suddenly demanded. But today I was nowhere near the busy front door. I sat on the soft carpeted floor of Noah's bedroom, far away from the growing crowd. We were building a large complex tower out of brightly coloured plastic blocks. Noah was still quiet, his little face pale and sad, but the simple repetitive task of stacking the blocks seemed to soothe his anxious mind. I handed him a blue piece, watching his small fingers carefully place it on top. Downstairs, the quiet murmur of polite arriving guests began to grow into a steady, confusing hum. I could hear the heavy front door opening and closing over and over again. I heard the delivery driver from the catering company asking loudly where to put the large hot trays of roasted chicken and vegetables. For a brief, conditioned second, my muscles twitched. My instinct screamed at me to jump up, run down the carpeted stairs, and handle the delivery before Martha got terribly upset. But I stayed firmly seated on the bedroom floor. I took a slow, deep breath and let the anxious feeling wash over me and then pass completely away. It was not my problem anymore. Moments later, I heard Martha's voice drifting sharply up the wooden stairs. "Emily," she called out, her tone tight with rising panic. "Emily, the caterers are here, and I do not know where you put the serving utensils." I did not answer her. I looked at Noah and gave him a gentle, reassuring smile. "Do you want to use the red block next, sweetie?" I asked him softly, entirely ignoring the chaotic drama unfolding below us. Emily Martha called again, her voice louder and much more demanding this time. "Where are you hiding?" I finally stood up, smoothing down the front of my simple black skirt. I walked slowly to the open bedroom door and looked down the long hallway. "I am upstairs with Noah. Martha." I called back down to her, my voice calm and perfectly even. "The silver serving spoons are in the bottom drawer by the large oven. You can just grab them yourself." There was a long, stunned silence from the bottom of the stairs. I could almost picture her face, frozen in absolute furious disbelief. In all the years I had been married to her son, I had never once told her to do something herself. I'd always dropped whatever I was doing and rushed to serve her. But today the heavy, invisible chains of my own making were finally broken. I stepped back into the quiet bedroom and closed the wooden door, shutting out the noise of the crowded house. I sat back down next to my son and picked up another plastic block. For the next 2 hours, the wake proceeded without my constant invisible management. I stayed upstairs, only venturing down to the bright kitchen once to get Noah a small plate of plain crackers and a cold juice box. When I walked through the crowded living room, the atmosphere felt incredibly tense and strangely disorganized. Guests were standing awkwardly in small groups, holding their winter coats over their arms because no one had offered to hang them in the hall closet. The large buffet table looked messy and unappealing. The heating trays were placed haphazardly, and the stack of small white napkins had fallen all over the floor. I saw Richard sitting in his usual large chair. He was frowning deeply, holding an empty ceramic teacup and looking around the busy room with obvious growing annoyance. He spotted me walking past and cleared his throat loudly. "Emily," he said, his voice gruff and impatient. "I've been waiting for a fresh cup of hot tea for over 20 minutes. I stopped walking and looked at him. I saw a grown man completely capable of walking into the kitchen and boiling water for himself. I saw a man who had watched me run myself into the ground for days without offering a single word of comfort. "The hot water kettle is on the kitchen counter, Richard," I said quietly, making sure my voice carried clearly over the dull chatter of the room. "The tea bags are right next to it in the small wooden box." I did not wait for his shocked response. I simply kept walking, holding my son's small snack, and headed back upstairs to our safe, quiet sanctuary. I could feel the stares of several guests boring into my back, but I kept my shoulders straight and my head held high. I was finally done playing the perfect submissive host to a family that did not even see me as a real person. After Noah finally fell asleep, exhausted by the heavy emotions of the long, confusing day, I gently pulled the soft blue blanket up to his small chin. I left his quiet bedroom, leaving the wooden door slightly ajar, and walked slowly down the carpeted hallway. I did not want to go back downstairs into the loud, chaotic mess of the crowded living room. Instead, I turned the brass knob and stepped into Mark's old study. The air in the small, familiar room still smelled faintly of his spicy cedar cologne and the old leather of his favourite desk chair. I closed the heavy door behind me, leaning against the cool wood, and let the profound, heavy silence of the room wash over my tired, aching body. I walked slowly over to his massive oak desk, running my trembling fingers across the smooth, polished surface. There was a small stack of paper bank statements sitting neatly next to his closed silver laptop. Looking at those simple white envelopes brought a sudden bitter taste to the back of my dry throat. For 10 long years, this dark, quiet room was where Mark and I spent our late evenings quietly managing the endless, draining demands of his selfish parents. They always presented themselves to the outside world as a wealthy, independent and highly distinguished couple. But behind closed doors, behind the expensive designer suits and the grand country club dinners, they were constantly crossing every reasonable boundary we ever tried to set. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down softly. I remembered the very first year we were married. Richard had made a terrible, highly impulsive investment in a failing commercial real estate deal. He had proudly refused to admit his massive failure to his prestigious friends, so he came to Mark, demanding a large sum of cash to quietly cover his humiliating losses. I had sat in this exact chair, rubbing my aching temples, as Mark nervously transferred thousands of dollars from our own hard-earned savings account just to save his father's fragile, arrogant pride. And when I politely suggested that we could not afford to keep bailing them out, Martha had looked at me with absolute freezing contempt. She had laughed at me, a short, sharp and deeply mocking sound. She told me that I simply did not understand how real successful families operated. She constantly reminded me in subtle, cutting ways that I came from a modest working-class background. I was just a simple public school teacher from a small, completely unimportant town in Ohio. In her wealthy status-obsessed eyes, I had won the absolute lottery by marrying her handsome, highly successful son. I was supposed to be eternally grateful and forever indebted to them for allowing me to simply exist in their elevated, sophisticated orbit. The heavy financial burdens were only half of the exhausting equation. The emotional trespassing was so much worse and so much harder to constantly bear. I stared at the framed photograph sitting right on the corner of the large desk. It was a picture of Mark and me, taken on our second wedding anniversary. We looked so incredibly young and so blindly, foolishly happy. But I clearly remembered the terrible day that photo was taken. Martha had shown up at our front door completely unannounced, holding a shiny new set of spare keys she had secretly copied without our permission. She walked right past me into my own private kitchen and proceeded to heavily criticize the simple meal I was lovingly preparing for our special romantic dinner. Mark had tried to politely stop her, he really did. But his overbearing parents had spent his entire childhood expertly training him to manage their volatile, dramatic emotions. He was deeply conditioned to keep the peace at any personal, painful cost to himself. So he would gently guide her out the front door, apologize quietly to me, and beg me to just let it go, because it was always easier than fighting a terrible, unwinnable war. And because I loved him so deeply, and because I desperately wanted to be a good, supportive partner, I swallowed my deep, burning hurt. I smiled politely at their awful, tense Sunday dinners. I bought Martha expensive, thoughtful birthday gifts that she never bothered to actually use or even say thank you for. I hosted their large, highly demanding holiday parties, cooking for 30 exhausted people while they sat comfortably in our living room, complaining loudly about the dry turkey or the cheap table wine. I did all the invisible, grueling, emotional labor to keep the fragile, cracked structure of our family intact. I was the soft, yielding cushion that constantly protected Mark from their sharp, cruel edges. But sitting in his silent study today, staring at the physical remnants of his shortened life, the absolute unfairness of it all crashed over me like a heavy, suffocating wave. My sweet husband was gone forever, and I was left holding the heavy, broken pieces of a deeply dysfunctional family that had never even liked me in the first place. They never saw my endless, tiring sacrifices as acts of deep, enduring love for their son. They only saw my quiet, polite compliance as simple, completely expected obedience. I was not a respected daughter-in-law. I was merely a convenient, unpaid manager for their dramatic, messy lives. And the devastating, truly heartbreaking truth was that Mark always knew it. He knew exactly how terribly they treated me, but the lifelong, suffocating guilt they had planted in his mind was simply too strong for him to ever fully break. I reached out slowly and picked up the heavy, silver-framed photo. A single hot tear escaped my burning eye, rolling slowly down my pale cheek and dropping onto the cold glass. "I loved you so much, Mark," I whispered softly to the empty, quiet room. "But I cannot do this anymore. I cannot keep protecting them when they have never ever protected me." I carefully placed the frame back on the desk, face down on the polished wood. I wiped my wet face, taking a long, shaky and deep breath. The sadness in my chest was definitely still there, a massive gaping hole, but it was slowly being joined by something else. Something much harder and much colder. It was absolute clarity. I finally saw them for exactly who they really were, and I knew with complete, unshakable certainty I was never going to shrink myself to fit into their world again. I stayed in the quiet study for a long time, simply listening to the muffled, confusing sounds of the crowded house below. When I finally walked back out into the long hallway, the noise from the main floor had drastically changed. It was no longer a steady, polite hum of respectful mourning. It was much louder, highly chaotic, and deeply edged with distinct irritation. I walked slowly to the top of the wooden stairs and looked down at the grand foyer. The elegant, seamless reception Martha had so desperately wanted was rapidly falling apart. Without my constant invisible management, the basic daily logistics of hosting 50 people were completely failing. The large catering trays of hot food had run empty over an hour ago. Nobody had bothered to replace them with the fresh backup trays currently sitting cold in the kitchen refrigerator. A large group of wealthy older guests were standing awkwardly near the dining room table, staring in deep confusion at the scraped, empty metal pans. Martha was darting back and forth across the crowded living room. Her perfect, highly composed facade was beginning to crack under the heavy, unexpected pressure of actual work. Her tailored black silk dress looked slightly wrinkled, and her normally perfect hair was falling out of place. "Where is the clean silverware?" Martha asked loudly, her voice rising in sharp panic as she cornered a confused catering assistant. "We cannot possibly expect the senior partners to eat their meals off dirty used plates." The young assistant looked completely overwhelmed and very scared. "I am so sorry, ma'am," he stammered nervously, glancing around the messy room. "The lady of the house usually shows us exactly where the extra supplies are kept, but we have not seen her for hours." Martha's face turned a deep, angry red. She looked wildly around the crowded room, her sharp eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces, desperately searching for me. But I remained perfectly hidden, standing in the dark shadows of the upstairs landing, simply watching the inevitable collapse of her carefully curated illusion. In the far corner of the living room, a large black trash bag had overflowed completely. Dirty paper plates and crumpled napkins were spilling openly onto the expensive imported rug. Richard was still sitting in his large, comfortable chair, but he was no longer holding court with quiet dignity. He was actively arguing with a distant cousin, complaining loudly and bitterly about the terrible, disorganized service in his son's home. It was almost entirely comical in a dark, incredibly sad way. These people prided themselves on their high social standing and their supreme, unquestionable competence. They genuinely believed that their massive wealth and status naturally commanded perfect order and immediate respect. But the harsh, undeniable truth was unfolding right in front of them. The only thing that ever made their grand family events run smoothly was my quiet, deeply unappreciated labour. I watched Martha rush back into the kitchen, the heavy swinging door flapping violently behind her. I could clearly hear her sharp voice echoing off the bright tile walls, berating the busy staff for things they did not understand. She was completely frantic, trying desperately to play the role of the gracious, grieving hostess, while simultaneously trying to manage the complicated, messy reality of a large gathering. She wanted the ultimate control, and she demanded all the social credit. But she absolutely refused to do any of the actual dirty work. And now, without me there to quietly fill in the massive glaring gaps, her total incompetence was on full embarrassing display for all her important friends to see. A prominent local judge, a wealthy man Richard deeply respected, walked over to the front hall closet to retrieve his heavy winter coat. He pulled the wooden door open, and a massive pile of hastily shoved jackets tumbled completely out onto the floor. The judge sighed heavily, looking clearly annoyed, and bent down awkwardly to dig through the messy, disorganized pile himself. I turned away from the stairs, feeling a strange, profound sense of peace. The immense, heavy guilt that had always governed my daily actions was entirely gone. They were finally facing the natural, unavoidable consequences of taking my hard work for granted. I walked quietly back down the carpeted hall toward Noah's safe room. Let them struggle, I thought to myself. Let them finally see exactly how much heavy weight I have been carrying all these long, exhausting years. I had barely reached the door of Noah's bedroom when the heavy, rapid sound of footsteps pounded up the wooden stairs behind me. I paused in the dim hallway, keeping my hand gently on the brass doorknob. I did not even have to turn around to know exactly who was coming for me. Emily Richards' voice boomed loudly, echoing off the high ceilings of the second floor. His tone was rough, completely filled with indignant, righteous anger. I turned slowly, facing the dark end of the long hallway. Richard and Martha were marching toward me, their faces twisted into ugly, familiar masks of deep resentment. Martha was breathing heavily, clutching a crumpled, stained napkin in her tightly balled fist. She looked completely dishevelled, a stark, shocking contrast to the perfectly polished woman who had arrived at my front door just a few hours ago. "What on earth is wrong with you, Martha?" hissed sharply, stopping just a few feet away from me. She kept her voice low, desperately, trying to keep the remaining guests downstairs from hearing her furious outburst. "You have completely abandoned your basic duties today, Emily. The entire house is an absolute embarrassing disaster." I looked calmly from her flushed, angry face to Richard's stern, judging eyes. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, forming a united, impenetrable front, completely ready to tear me down, just as they always did. "The catering company is utterly useless," Richard added coldly, stepping closer to me, trying to use his large size to physically intimidate me. "Important, highly respected colleagues of my son are leaving our family home hungry and deeply insulted. And where are you? You are hiding upstairs like a frightened, useless child." I kept my back firmly straight, pressing my spine gently against the solid wood of the closed door. I felt a small, fleeting flutter of old anxiety in my chest, the deeply ingrained habit of immediate submissive apology trying desperately to rise to the surface, but I quickly pushed it down, replacing it with the cold, hard clarity I had found in the quiet study. "I am not hiding, Richard," I replied evenly, making sure to pause, taking a slow, steady breath. "I am exactly where I need to be right now. I am upstairs quietly taking care of my grieving 6-year-old son." Martha let out a harsh, bitter scoff, throwing her hands up in the air. "Do not use that poor child as a convenient excuse for your incredible laziness," she snapped cruelly. "We are all grieving today, Emily. We just lost our only beloved son. but we are still down there, acting like responsible adults trying to honor his important memory, while you completely embarrass us in front of the entire community." Her words were designed to hurt, expertly crafted, to strike directly at my deepest, most vulnerable insecurities. In the past, those exact sharp words would have instantly brought me to my knees in shameful tears. I would have run quickly down the stairs, frantically apologizing to every single guest, desperately trying to fix the messy situation and earn back their impossible approval. But today, looking at their angry, defensive faces, I only saw the pathetic, desperate truth. They were not mad because I was disrespecting Mark. They were furious because their own terrible incompetence was finally exposed to the world, and they needed a convenient, easy scapegoat to blame. "You are embarrassed, Martha?" I asked quietly, tilting my head slightly to the side. "Because the food is cold and the coats are messy." "Yes," she spat back angrily, stepping even closer. "It is highly disrespectful to everyone here." I nodded slowly, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch between us for a long moment. "If you wanted the catering to run perfectly, Martha," I said, keeping my voice very soft and incredibly steady, "you should have managed the caterers yourself. You are the one who insisted on inviting 50 people to my private home today. You are the one who demanded total control over the guest list and the expensive menu." Richard's face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. "How dare you speak to your mother-in-law like that?" he demanded loudly, completely forgetting to keep his booming voice down. "After everything we have done for you, after we welcomed you into this prestigious family, this is how you repay us in our darkest hour. You are incredibly selfish, Emily." The word selfish hung heavily in the air between us. It was their favourite, most effective weapon. I looked directly into Richard's cold, furious eyes. I thought about the thousands of dollars we had quietly paid to fix his secret mistakes. I thought about the countless exhausted holidays I had spent cooking and cleaning for their demanding friends while they sat back and complained. I thought about my beautiful, kind husband, who had spent his entire shortened life desperately trying to earn their elusive, conditional love. "I am selfish," I repeated softly, the single word feeling strange and heavy on my tongue. I took a slow step forward, moving away from the protective door and closing the physical distance between us. "I have spent 10 years completely bending over backward to make your lives easier. I have swallowed every insult, every subtle dig, and every cruel demand because I loved your son. But Mark is gone now, and I am no longer required to be your unpaid servant." Martha gasped loudly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth in absolute dramatic shock. "You are a terrible, deeply ungrateful woman," she whispered fiercely. "If the party is a disaster, Martha," I said calmly, completely, ignoring her dramatic insult, "it is because you do not know how to actually work for anything yourself. Now, if you will excuse me, I am going to return to my son." I turned the brass knob, pushed the heavy bedroom door open and stepped inside. I closed the door firmly, right in their shocked, angry faces, the soft click of the lock echoing loudly, with finality in the quiet room. I leaned my forehead against the painted wood, listening to their angry, muffled whispers in the hallway, until their heavy footsteps finally retreated back down the stairs. I was shaking slightly, my heart pounding loudly in my chest, but for the very first time in my entire adult life, I did not feel afraid. I felt incredibly, deeply free. I stayed in the quiet safe room for another 30 minutes. I sat on the soft carpet, watching Noah sleep peacefully wrapped in his favourite blue blanket. My mind was completely clear, and my heart was incredibly steady. The terrifying storm of anxiety that usually controlled my every move was entirely gone. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I reached into my small black purse and pulled out my phone. I searched my contacts and found the private number that Mark had given me just 2 months before he died. Mark had been sick for a long time, but his parents had absolutely refused to acknowledge the severe reality of his illness. They believed that massive wealth and sheer willpower could conquer anything, including a terminal diagnosis. But Mark knew the sad truth, and he knew exactly how ruthless his family could be. He spent his final weeks quietly moving his financial assets and changing his legal documents entirely behind their backs. He did it all to ensure that Noah and I would be completely protected from their endless greed. I dialed the number and lifted the phone to my ear. It rang only twice before a calm, professional voice answered. "Hello, this is Mr. Davis," the deep voice said smoothly. "It is Emily," I replied softly, making sure my sleeping son did not wake up. "It is time. They are actively trying to push me out of the house. Please come right now." "We are already on our way," Emily the lawyer assured me. "We will be there in 15 minutes. I ended the short call and slipped the phone back into my purse. I walked over to the large bed and gently shook Noah's shoulder. He opened his big brown eyes, looking sleepy and confused. "It is time to go downstairs, sweetie," I whispered, smoothing his messy hair. "We need to say goodbye to the guests, and then we can finally rest." I took his small, warm hand, and we walked slowly out of the bedroom. As we descended the grand wooden staircase, the loud, chaotic noise of the living room hit us like a heavy wall. The catering disaster had not improved at all. Guests were clearly frustrated, whispering to each other and looking constantly at their expensive watches. Martha and Richard were standing near the large front door, speaking in hushed, angry tones to a few of their wealthy, influential friends. When Martha looked up and saw me walking down the stairs, her face twisted into a mask of pure, cold fury. She stepped away from her important friends and marched directly toward the bottom of the staircase, blocking my path completely. "Have you finally decided to come out of hiding?" Martha demanded loudly, her sharp voice cutting through the dull chatter of the room. The entire living room went completely silent. Every single guest stopped talking and turned quickly to watch the unfolding drama. Martha wanted a captive audience. She wanted to publicly humiliate me, to firmly reassert her absolute dominance over the entire family. I stopped on the bottom step, keeping Noah safely tucked behind my legs. I did not look down at the dark floor. I looked directly into her angry, bitter eyes. "I was not hiding, Martha," I said evenly, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet, tense room. "I was simply waiting for the right moment to finally come down here." Richard pushed his way aggressively through the small crowd, standing closely next to his furious wife. His face was a dangerous, deep shade of red. "Do not take that disrespectful tone with us, Emily," he barked loudly, pointing a thick, accusing finger right at my face. "You have completely ruined this entire memorial. You have deeply embarrassed our proud family, and you have shown absolutely zero respect for my late son. You are a terrible, selfish woman, and we are completely done tolerating you." I did not flinch and I did not cry. I simply stood there, absorbing their toxic, familiar anger without letting it break my spirit. "Pack your cheap bags," Richard ordered cruelly, his voice echoing in the large, silent space. "You are leaving this house today. We will gladly take over the care of our grandson, since you are clearly unfit to be a proper mother. But you are no longer welcome in our family home. Get out right now before I call the local police and have you physically removed for trespassing." The sudden, cruel threat of taking my young son caused a collective gasp to ripple through the wealthy crowd. A few short months ago, those exact words would have completely destroyed me. I would have fallen to my knees, begging desperately for their mercy, terrified of their massive wealth and their powerful legal connections. But today, their empty, vicious threats meant absolutely nothing to me. "This is not your house, Richard," I replied, my voice incredibly calm and remarkably steady. Martha let out a short, high-pitched laugh of pure disbelief. You are completely delusional, Emily, she spat out viciously. Mark bought this expensive house with the massive salary he earned from his father's prestigious company. Everything in this building legally belongs to us now. You brought absolutely nothing to this marriage, and you will leave with absolutely nothing. I took a slow, deep breath. I could feel Noah gripping my dark skirt, his small hands trembling slightly. I reached back and gently squeezed his warm hand silently, promising him that we were completely safe. You are deeply mistaken, I said quietly, locking my eyes firmly with Martha's. Mark knew exactly who you were. He knew exactly what you would do to us the moment he was finally gone. So he made absolutely sure that you would never have the power to hurt us again. Before Martha could scream her terrible, angry response, the heavy wooden front door opened with a loud click. The cold, sharp winter wind rushed into the stifling, tense living room. Two men dressed in immaculate dark grey suits walked confidently into the grand foyer. One of them carried a thick black leather briefcase. The wealthy guests parted nervously, stepping back quickly to make a clear, wide path for the unexpected strangers. Richard turned around quickly, his face flushing with fresh, indignant anger. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded loudly, stepping aggressively toward the two men. "This is a private, deeply personal family gathering. You are trespassing on my property. Get out of here right now." The taller man stopped in the dead center of the room. He looked at Richard, his expression completely blank and purely professional. He did not look intimidated at all. "I am Mr. Davis," the man stated clearly, his deep voice commanding immediate, absolute attention. "I am the senior legal executor of Mark's estate, and we are here to formally execute his final legally binding will." The entire room froze instantly. The suffocating silence was so incredibly deep, you could hear the old grandfather clock ticking loudly in the hallway. I looked at Martha and watched the arrogant, cruel colour completely drain from her shocked face. The heavy, invisible power dynamic in the room had just shifted permanently, and they were entirely, completely powerless to stop it. Richard stepped forward, his large fists clenched tightly at his sides. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Richard sputtered loudly, his voice shaking heavily with a strange mix of deep rage and sudden, undeniable fear. "I am his father, and I naturally manage all of his major financial accounts. There is absolutely no need for any legal theatrics today. Mark did not have a private will because he always knew that everything naturally goes back to his real family. Mr. Davis did not blink and he did not step back. He slowly unlatched the shiny silver locks on his heavy leather briefcase. The loud, sharp clicks echoed loudly across the dead, silent living room. He pulled out a thick white folder and calmly adjusted his silver-framed glasses. Mark updated his final will exactly 2 months ago. Mr. Davis stated clearly, his voice projecting easily over the quiet, staring crowd. He was in full possession of his mental faculties, and the legal documents were carefully witnessed by 3 independent medical doctors. He was fully aware of the exact, permanent actions he was taking. Martha grabbed her husband's arm, her expensive manicured nails digging deeply into his dark suit jacket. "This is a terrible mistake," Martha whispered frantically, her panicked eyes darting wildly around the room, seeing the deeply shocked faces of her wealthy friends. "We did not know anything about this. Why would he do this secretly, entirely behind our backs?" Mr. Davis opened the thick folder and pulled out a crisp white document. "Because he explicitly requested total legal confidentiality," the lawyer replied smoothly without an ounce of pity. "I will now read the primary directives of the legal estate." The entire room held its collective breath. I stood quietly at the bottom of the wooden stairs, holding my young son's warm hand. I felt a sudden massive wave of profound, heartbreaking love for my late husband. Even in his final, incredibly painful days when his body was failing him completely, he was working tirelessly in secret to build a safe, impenetrable fortress around us. He was fighting his last quiet battle to finally slay the dragons he could never defeat in life. According to the irrevocable trust established by the deceased, Mr. Davis began reading his voice slow and highly deliberate. All movable and immovable assets, including this primary residence, are hereby transferred in their absolute entirety to his legal wife, Emily. A collective loud gasp rippled quickly through the crowded living room. Martha physically stumbled backward as if she had been violently pushed in the chest. "No!" she gasped loudly, bringing a trembling, pale hand up to her shocked mouth. "That is our family money. He cannot just give our expensive property away to a common, uneducated woman." Mr. Davis completely ignored her dramatic offensive outburst and simply continued reading the binding paperwork. Furthermore, all financial accounts, stock portfolios, and life insurance policies have been permanently placed into a secure locked trust for the sole benefit of his wife and his minor son, Noah. The deceased explicitly stipulated in clear legal terms that under no circumstances shall his parents, Richard and Martha, have any legal access or administrative control over these protected funds. Richard's face lost all of its angry, vibrant colour, turning a sickly pale shade of white. He looked completely broken, staring blankly at the calm, professional lawyer. "You are lying," Richard whispered hoarsely, the booming, authoritative voice completely gone from his hollow chest. "I put him in that lucrative business. I gave him his start in life. He would never, ever betray his own flesh and blood like this." Mr. Davis lowered the thick document and looked directly into Richard's terrified eyes. "The deceased left a personal attached letter regarding this exact matter," Mr. Davis said quietly, pulling out a smaller piece of paper. He explicitly cited a long, heavily documented history of severe financial manipulation and deep emotional distress deliberately caused by his parents. He structured this legal trust specifically to protect his immediate family from any further abuse or unwarranted interference. The heavy, brutal truth finally crashed down completely upon the crowded, silent room. The wealthy, judgmental friends who had looked down on me all morning were now staring at Martha and Richard with open, undeniable disgust. The perfect, flawless image they had spent decades carefully building was completely, totally shattered into a million tiny pieces. They were officially exposed not as loving, grieving parents, but as cruel, manipulative bullies who had finally pushed their only son entirely too far. I stepped forward, dropping my son's hand for just a brief, necessary moment. I walked right up to Martha, who was trembling violently, staring at the expensive floor in absolute crushing defeat. "You spent 10 years constantly telling me I was nothing," I said softly, making sure only she could hear my steady voice. "You treated me like an unpaid servant, and you called my innocent son a burden in his own beautiful home. But Mark knew exactly what we were really worth, and he made sure you could never touch us again." Martha finally looked up at me, tears of pure humiliation pooling in her cold, aging eyes. She had absolutely nothing left to say. Her money, her supreme power, and her cruel authority had been stripped away entirely by the son she thought she completely controlled. "Now," I said quietly, gesturing toward the heavy wooden door, "pack your things, Martha, and get out of my house." The heavy silence in the grand living room finally broke. It did not break with a loud, angry shout or a dramatic, crying plea. It broke with the soft, highly uncomfortable sound of people trying desperately to leave. The wealthy, judgmental friends who had spent the entire morning whispering cruel things about me suddenly could not get out of the front door fast enough. They quietly grabbed their expensive winter coats from the messy pile on the wooden floor. They did not stop to offer their fake, polite condolences to Martha or Richard. They simply kept their heads down, completely avoiding any eye contact, and scurried quickly out into the cold, grey afternoon. Within 15 minutes, the large, crowded house was completely empty of strangers. Only the tired caterers remained in the back kitchen, quickly and silently packing up their heavy metal trays. Mr. Davis, the calm and professional lawyer, stood near the grand staircase, quietly organising his important legal papers. And standing in the exact centre of the ruined, messy room were my former in-laws. They looked incredibly small and deeply, profoundly broken. Richard was staring blankly at the expensive imported rug. His broad, arrogant shoulders were slumped heavily forward. He looked like an old, entirely defeated man, completely stripped of his loud, booming power. For his entire highly privileged life, he had easily solved every single problem by throwing massive amounts of money and cruel intimidation at it. But he could not buy his way out of this profound public humiliation. His own son had legally and permanently declared him a completely untrustworthy parent. Martha was still trembling slightly, her perfect manicured hands clutching the edge of a small wooden table just to keep her fragile balance. The harsh, bitter mask of supreme superiority had finally slipped completely off her pale face. What remained was a look of absolute devastating shock. She slowly turned her head and looked around the quiet, beautiful house. She was not looking at the expensive furniture or the large, impressive windows. She was finally truly looking at the massive, empty void that Mark had permanently left behind. They were both forced to look deeply into a very harsh, unforgiving mirror. For decades they had loudly convinced themselves that they were the absolute centre of their son's universe. They genuinely believed their massive wealth gave them the ultimate right to dictate his every single choice. But the cold-binding legal documents resting safely in that dark briefcase told a completely different, undeniable story. It told the sad story of a desperate, loving husband who had to legally banish his own parents just to keep his vulnerable wife and child safe. She realised in that quiet, terrible moment that she had actually lost her beloved son many long years ago. She had lost him the very first time she demanded his blind obedience over his genuine happiness. She had pushed him completely away with her constant, cruel criticisms and her endless, entirely selfish demands. Mark had simply stopped fighting with her because he knew deep down she would never ever listen. He had smiled politely. He had dutifully attended her boring, stuffy dinners, and then he had quietly, desperately built a strong legal wall to protect his real family from her toxic grasp. "You planned this," Martha whispered softly, her voice barely carrying across the large empty room. Her tone was no longer angry or sharply accusing. It was simply hollow and deeply, incredibly tired. "You turned him entirely against us, Emily. You made him hate his own mother." I walked slowly toward her, stopping just a few feet away. I did not feel any sharp anger toward her anymore. The burning, resentful rage had completely burned itself out, leaving only a deep, profound sadness in my chest. "I did not turn him against you, Martha," I said quietly, making sure my voice was completely gentle but absolutely firm. "You did that entirely on your own. He loved you both so much, but he was incredibly exhausted. He was entirely tired of constantly protecting me from your sharp, cruel words. He was tired of your highly conditional love." Richard finally looked up, his old eyes glassy and very red. "He was my only son," Richard said, his voice cracking painfully in the quiet, still room. "How are we supposed to live the rest of our lives knowing he thought so terribly of us?" I took a slow, deep breath. "That is a heavy, painful question, Richard," I replied honestly. But it is a question you will have to figure out the final answer to in your own house. You need to gather your personal belongings right now, and you need to leave." They did not try to argue with me again. The aggressive fighting spirit had been completely drained from their heavy bodies. They walked slowly and very heavily up the wooden stairs to the large guest bedroom they had claimed as their own. I stood in the quiet foyer, holding Noah very closely against my side. He wrapped his small warm arms around my waist, resting his tired head against my soft hip. I gently stroked his soft brown hair, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of his breathing. Mr. Davis walked over to me, snapping his heavy leather briefcase completely shut. "The legal documents are fully filed with the courts, and the immediate transfer is entirely complete," he said professionally, handing me a small white business card. "The house locks will be professionally changed by a locksmith within the next 2 hours. If they attempt to return or cause any further legal trouble, you are to call me immediately." "Thank you, Mr. Davis," I said sincerely, taking the small card and holding it tightly, "for everything you did for Mark, and for protecting us today." He gave me a small, highly respectful nod. "He was a very good, deeply honourable man," Emily, the lawyer, said softly. "He loved you both more than anything else in the entire world. Have a peaceful, quiet evening." After the lawyer left, I stood completely alone in the quiet hallway, listening to the heavy, shuffling footsteps upstairs. 20 minutes later, Martha and Richard came back down the long stairs carrying 2 small, expensive leather suitcases. They did not look at me, and they did not say goodbye to Noah. They walked slowly to the large front door, opened it quietly, and stepped out into the cold, grey evening air. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, with a final echoing sound of complete closure. The massive house was finally entirely ours, and for the very first time in a long, terrible week I felt like I could truly, deeply breathe. The house was completely silent for the very first time in what felt like an absolute eternity. It was well past midnight. I sat entirely alone at the large kitchen island, holding a warm cup of herbal tea. Noah was fast asleep upstairs, in his safe room, completely undisturbed by the heavy, dramatic events of the long day. The shiny new brass locks, installed by the emergency locksmith just a few short hours ago, gleamed softly in the dim yellow light over the door. I was physically exhausted, my tired bones aching with a deep, heavy weariness, but my anxious mind was finally quiet. The massive, oppressive weight of my demanding in-laws was completely gone. Then a very soft, incredibly hesitant knock broke the quiet stillness of the dark room. It came directly from the heavy glass of the back patio door. I froze instantly, my heart giving a sudden anxious flutter in my chest. I set my warm ceramic mug down on the smooth marble counter and walked slowly toward the back of the dark kitchen. I peered carefully through the thick, cold glass panes. Standing alone on the dark brick patio, illuminated only by the pale silver moonlight, was Martha. She was completely by herself. She was not wearing her expensive tailored winter coat, but only a simple thin sweater, shivering noticeably in the freezing night air. My very first deeply ingrained instinct was to turn off the warm kitchen lights and walk entirely away. She had caused me so much terrible, unnecessary pain for 10 long years. But as I looked closely at her through the glass, I did not see the terrifying, cruel matriarch anymore. I saw a very old, deeply broken mother, who had just buried her only beloved child and lost her entire remaining family in a single devastating afternoon. I took a slow, steady breath, reached out and unlocked the heavy door. I pulled it open, letting the freezing, bitter winter wind sweep into the warm kitchen. Emily Martha whispered softly, her voice cracking painfully in the cold air. "I am so incredibly sorry to bother you so late at night. Richard is fast asleep at the hotel, and I just could not stop my mind from racing. Please, Emily, can I just come inside for a single minute?" I stood in the open doorway for a long moment, carefully studying her pale, deeply tear-stained face. I stepped back slowly, opening the heavy wooden door wider. "Come in, Martha," I said quietly, gesturing toward the warm kitchen island. "Sit down before you freeze to death out there." She walked slowly into the bright room, wrapping her thin, frail arms tightly around her shivering body. She sat heavily on the tall wooden stool, looking incredibly fragile and completely lost in the large space. I walked over to the stainless steel stove, turned on the gas burner, and began to boil fresh water. I did not ask her what she wanted to drink. I simply prepared a second cup of hot tea, the quiet, familiar routine feeling strangely comforting to us both. I set the warm, steaming mug gently in front of her, and sat down heavily on the opposite side of the marble counter. We sat in absolute heavy silence for several long minutes. Martha simply stared down at the dark, steaming liquid, her trembling, aged hands wrapped tightly around the warm mug. A single heavy tear slipped from her red eye, splashing quietly into the hot tea. Then another tear fell, and another, until she was weeping completely openly, her thin shoulders shaking with deep, uncontrollable sobs. It was not the dramatic, performative crying she had displayed at the public funeral. It was a raw, agonizing, and entirely ugly wail of pure, utter heartbreak. "I completely failed him," Martha sobbed loudly, burying her wet, wrinkled face in her shaking hands. "I absolutely failed my beautiful, sweet boy, Emily. I did not reach out across the counter to physically comfort her, but I did not stop her from crying either. I simply sat there, a quiet, steady, and entirely calm presence in the warm room, allowing her to finally feel the massive, crushing weight of her own terrible actions. When Mark was just a little boy, Martha continued, her voice completely ragged and thick with heavy tears. He was so incredibly gentle and so deeply, profoundly sweet. Richard was always so terribly hard on him, constantly demanding absolute flawless perfection and pushing him endlessly to be a ruthless, successful man. I was so terrified that my gentle Mark would not survive in Richard's harsh, competitive world. I was terrified he would be seen as weak, and that ruthless people would take terrible advantage of his kind heart. So I pushed him too. I controlled every single aspect of his young life because I foolishly, stupidly thought I was protecting him from failure. She wiped her wet, swollen eyes with the back of her trembling hand, completely uncaring about her ruined, expensive makeup. "When he met you, Emily, he changed so much," she confessed quietly, looking up at me with profound, devastating regret in her tired eyes. He became so incredibly soft and so entirely focused on his own simple happiness instead of our grand, demanding family legacy. I was absolutely terrified of losing my firm, controlling grip on him. I saw you as a massive, dangerous threat to the perfect, highly controlled future I had planned for him. So I criticized you, I belittled your background, and I tried desperately every single day to drive a deep, permanent wedge between you two. I took a slow, careful sip of my warm tea, letting the soothing liquid warm my tight, aching throat. "You did not protect him from anything, Martha," I said gently, but with absolute unwavering honesty. "You only taught him that your love was entirely, strictly conditional. You taught him that he had to constantly earn his secure place in your family by constantly sacrificing his own internal peace." I know she cried out loudly, fresh tears streaming rapidly down her pale, aging cheeks. And the absolute most devastating part is that my terrible, selfish need for total control is exactly what drove him completely away in the end. He locked me out of his entire beautiful life, and he legally locked me out of my only grandson's life because he knew exactly what I was. He knew I would absolutely ruin them too. I have absolutely nothing left in this world, Emily. My only son is dead. My husband is a broken, bitterly angry man, and I am completely, utterly alone in the dark. The heavy, agonizing truth of her painful words hung thickly in the warm kitchen air. She had finally entirely stripped away all the arrogant, toxic layers of her massive pride, laying her deepest, darkest fears completely bare on my kitchen counter. I looked closely at the older woman who had tormented me relentlessly for a decade, and for the very first time I did not feel any fear or any lingering, bitter resentment. I only felt a profound, quiet pity for a desperate mother who had loved her child so poorly that she essentially forced him to legally banish her from the grave. I watched Martha cry her heavy tears falling silently into the warm tea. The quiet kitchen felt incredibly heavy, thick with the profound weight of her sudden, honest confession. Then another slight movement caught my eye. Outside the heavy glass door, standing deep in the freezing dark shadows of the patio, was Richard. He was wearing a thick winter coat, quickly thrown over his wrinkled pajamas. He looked through the cold glass panes, his broad face pale and entirely devoid of his usual intimidating anger. He had quietly followed his devastated wife, walking through the freezing, bitter night, completely unable to be alone with his dark thoughts. I stood up slowly from my stool and walked back to the patio door. I unlocked the brass latch again, pulling the heavy door wide open for the second time tonight. Richard stepped inside, bringing the sharp, icy smell of winter with him. He did not say a single word at first. He walked slowly over to the bright kitchen island and stood right behind his crying wife. He placed a large, trembling hand gently on her shaking shoulder. It was the very first time in 10 long, exhausting years that I had ever seen him offer her a moment of genuine, quiet, physical comfort. "Thank you for letting her in," Emily Richard said softly, his deep voice sounding incredibly raspy and profoundly tired. We could not sleep at all. The dark hotel room was completely silent, and the terrifying, crushing reality simply suffocated us both. I walked back around the marble island and sat down on my wooden stool. "You are both hurting so much," I said quietly, looking directly at their pale, completely exhausted faces. "You just lost your only beloved son. The deep, agonizing pain of that terrible loss is something I truly, intimately understand." I held his hand when he took his last breath. I felt my entire world completely shatter. We are all drowning together in the exact same terrible grief tonight. Richard looked down, staring blankly at the smooth marble counter. "I was a foolish, incredibly arrogant man," he confessed quietly, his booming voice breaking slightly in the quiet room. "I built a massive, highly successful company from absolutely nothing, and I wrongly thought I could build my own family the exact same way. I demanded total obedience, and I completely punished anyone who dared to question my strict authority. I genuinely thought I was making Mark incredibly strong to survive in a harsh world, but I was really just pushing him away. I completely lost my son long before he ever got terribly sick." The heavy silence returned to the kitchen, but this time it did not feel toxic or remotely dangerous. It felt exactly like a deep, painfully infected wound finally being washed clean. I looked at both of them, seeing the shattered, broken remnants of their massive, overwhelming pride. "I know that you loved him," I said, gently leaning slightly forward across the wide island. "I truly do know that. And I know deep down in my heart that Mark loved you both very much. He carried the heavy, crushing burden of your extreme expectations because he desperately wanted to make you proud. But the way you treated me over the years was completely unacceptable, and the terrible way you treated Noah today was the absolute final straw." Martha flinched visibly, closing her wet, swollen eyes as fresh tears spilled rapidly down her cheeks. "I was so incredibly angry, Martha," whispered her voice shaking violently with profound shame. I was so fiercely angry that Mark was gone, and I took all of that terrible, ugly rage out on a completely innocent, grieving child. I called my own beautiful grandson a burden, right in front of all my friends. I will never ever forgive myself for that cruel, thoughtless moment. You cannot ever speak to him like that again, I stated firmly, keeping my voice very level but absolutely unyielding. Noah is only 6 years old. He is completely pure. He does not care about your massive wealth or your high social status. He just lost his wonderful father, and he is trying desperately to understand a completely terrifying, broken world. He needs deep, unconditional love, and he needs absolute, unwavering safety. He does not need harsh discipline or cruel emotional manipulation. If you ever want to be a part of his life, that toxic cycle of abuse has to stop entirely right now. We know, Richard said softly, nodding his grey head slowly, tears finally filling his own tired eyes. We completely understand, Emily. The legal trust and the painful letters Mark left behind in that briefcase were a massive, deeply humiliating wake-up call. He stripped away all of our controlling power because we completely proved we could not be trusted with it. He bravely chose to protect his own son from our terrible, selfish mistakes. I looked deeply into Richard's tired red eyes. Mark finally broke the toxic cycle, I said quietly, feeling a sudden immense surge of deep, enduring pride for my brave husband. He used his last dying energy to make absolutely sure that Noah would never have to carry the heavy, impossible emotional burdens he carried. And as Noah's mother, I am going to make absolutely sure that Mark's final desperate wish is completely honoured. Martha reached out slowly across the smooth counter. She did not try to forcefully grab my hand. She simply rested her trembling, wrinkled fingers near my warm tea mug. We do not want to be completely cut out of his life, Emily, she pleaded softly, her voice full of desperate, naked hope. He is the absolute only piece of Mark that we have left in this dark world. We will gladly do whatever you ask of us. We will strictly follow any rules you make if you will just allow us to sometimes see our grandson. It was a massive, truly monumental shift in power. They were no longer demanding my total obedience or loudly threatening me with their vast wealth and legal connections. They were completely humbled, sitting quietly in my kitchen, openly begging for the simple, basic grace to be a part of my family. I looked at the two broken, grieving parents, and I knew that the long, terrible war was finally over. The bitter, toxic foundation of their family had completely collapsed, leaving only the raw, honest truth behind. I took a long, slow breath, looking deeply at their pale, desperate faces. It was incredibly tempting to completely shut the heavy glass door and never let them back into our quiet lives. But I knew deep down in my aching heart that Noah loved his grandparents, and that Mark would want them to at least have a small chance to finally change. Okay, I said quietly, my voice very steady and completely firm. I will allow you to be a part of his young life, but things are going to be entirely different from this exact moment forward. Martha nodded quickly, fresh tears spilling rapidly down her wrinkled cheeks. Anything? Emily, she whispered softly, her voice incredibly fragile. We will do absolutely anything you say. I folded my hands together, resting them gently on the cool marble counter. First, I began slowly making sure my words carried absolute weight. There will be absolutely no unannounced visits to this house. You will call ahead of time, and you will politely ask if it is a good time to come over. If I say no, you will completely respect my decision without any arguments or heavy guilt trips. Richard nodded his grey head slowly, his broad shoulders slumped in complete, unconditional agreement. We fully understand, he replied quietly, his deep voice thick with heavy emotion. Secondly, I continued keeping my gaze locked firmly on Martha. There will be absolutely zero criticism regarding how I raise my son or how I choose to run my own household. You will not ever undermine my parental authority. You will not buy him incredibly expensive gifts just to win his favour, and you will definitely not speak poorly about me or my modest family background ever again. If you have a serious disagreement with me, you will bring it to me privately and we will discuss it quietly like mature, respectful adults. I paused for a long moment, making absolutely sure they fully absorbed the crushing weight of my strict new rules. And finally I said firmly, my voice leaving absolutely no room for any negotiation. You will never ever raise your voice at Noah. You will not call him cruel names. You will not project your own heavy, toxic anxieties onto him, and you will treat his pure, innocent feelings with the absolute utmost care and deep respect. If you break any of these clear boundaries, even once, the supervised visits will immediately stop, and you will not see him again. The quiet, warm kitchen was completely still, as they silently processed the strict new reality of our changing relationship. It was a massive, incredibly difficult pill for them to swallow after several decades of having absolute, unquestionable control over everyone around them. But they did not try to argue, and they did not try to negotiate the firm terms. The crushing, undeniable reality of Mark's legal will and the deep, agonizing pain of their massive loss had finally broken their stubborn pride completely. "We completely accept your terms, Emily," Richard said softly, reaching out across the counter to gently squeeze Martha's trembling hand. "We know we have a massive amount of terrible damage to repair, and we are truly deeply sorry for all the completely unnecessary pain we caused you over the years." I looked at the two of them sitting quietly at my kitchen island in the very middle of the dark night. It was definitely not a magical, perfect fix. The deep, incredibly painful scars of the last 10 years were not going to magically disappear overnight. There would still be awkward, incredibly difficult moments ahead, and building any genuine trust would take a very long, exhausting time. But the heavily toxic, completely unbalanced dynamic was finally destroyed forever. We were no longer playing their cruel, totally unwinnable game. "It is incredibly late," I said quietly, standing up slowly from my wooden stool. "You both need to go back to your quiet hotel and try desperately to get some sleep. We have a very long, difficult road ahead of us, and we all need significant time to heal." Martha stood up slowly, wiping her wet, tired face with a crumpled tissue. She looked directly at me with a strange, entirely new expression in her swollen eyes. It was not her usual harsh judgment or her cold, dismissive arrogance. It was a look of quiet, genuine respect. "Thank you, Emily," she whispered softly, her voice trembling slightly in the cool room. "Thank you so much for giving us a second chance." I walked them slowly to the heavy front door, watching quietly as they stepped back out into the freezing, dark winter night. The heavy wooden door clicked shut firmly behind them, and I locked the shiny new brass deadbolt with a satisfying, solid sound. I leaned my tired head against the cool painted wood, closing my burning, exhausted eyes. The darkest, most terrifying storm of my entire life had finally completely passed. We were incredibly safe, and for the very first time in a decade, I was the one entirely in control. 6 months passed slowly, turning the bitter, freezing winter into a bright, hopeful spring. The heavy, dark curtains in the grand living room were finally pulled wide open. Warm, golden sunlight spilled across the expensive imported rug, where a colourful, messy pile of plastic blocks now sat completely undisturbed. The massive house, which had once felt like a cold, highly demanding museum, finally felt like a real, comfortable home. The stifling, invisible weight that had crushed my spirit for 10 long years was entirely, beautifully gone. It was a quiet, perfectly ordinary Saturday morning. I stood at the kitchen island flipping thick golden pancakes on the hot griddle. Noah was sitting on his tall wooden stool, happily swinging his small legs and completely covered in sticky, sweet maple syrup. He was laughing loudly at a silly cartoon playing softly on my phone. The sound of his pure, innocent joy echoing off the bright tile walls was the most incredibly beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. I slid a warm, fresh pancake onto his small plate. "Be careful, sweetie," I said gently, handing him a clean fork. "It is still a little bit hot." Noah smiled up at me, his big brown eyes sparkling brightly in the morning light. "Thank you, Mom," he mumbled cheerfully, immediately digging his fork into the fluffy breakfast. I poured myself a fresh cup of hot coffee and leaned comfortably against the smooth marble counter. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the sweet smell of vanilla and warm syrup fill my tired senses. My chest did not tighten, with sudden terrifying anxiety at the prospect of the long weekend. I did not have to spend my precious Saturday morning frantically cleaning the already spotless house or nervously planning a complicated, expensive dinner menu for impossible guests. The weekend belonged entirely to us, and we were completely free to do absolutely nothing at all. The grieving process was definitely not a perfect straight line. There were still incredibly difficult, very dark days. There were quiet, lonely nights when the profound, agonizing absence of Mark felt like a heavy, physical weight on my chest. I still cried for him, missing his gentle smile and the safe, comforting warmth of his arms. But the deep, painful sadness I felt now was entirely clean. It was no longer mixed with the toxic, suffocating anxiety of trying to appease his demanding, impossible parents. I was finally allowed to simply grieve my beloved husband without the constant, cruel interference of their massive, overbearing pride. I had also learned very slowly how to stop carrying the heavy emotional burden entirely by myself. For a decade, I had silently swallowed my own desperate needs, isolating myself from my own family, just to keep the fragile, terrible peace with his. But over the last 6 months, I had completely rebuilt my own strong support system. My sister Sarah had driven over from Ohio entirely unannounced, the very weekend after the terrible funeral. She did not ask me what I needed or wait for my polite permission. She simply walked through the heavy front door, handed me a massive box of cheap, greasy takeout food, and told me to go straight to sleep. She had spent the entire week cleaning my messy kitchen, playing loud, silly games with Noah, and quietly holding me while I sobbed entirely uncontrollably on the soft living room couch. I had finally realized that true, deep love did not require constant, exhausting sacrifices or perfect, flawless performance. True love simply showed up and quietly shared the heavy, agonizing load. I had also started attending a small local support group for young grieving widows. Sitting in a circle of brave, completely shattered women, I finally found my own voice again. I learned how to firmly set healthy boundaries, and I learned that saying no was a complete, highly respectable sentence. I was no longer the weak, overly accommodating girl who had desperately sought the impossible approval of wealthy, arrogant people. I was a strong, fiercely protective mother who had successfully stared down a terrible storm and survived completely intact. The shrill, sudden ringing of my cell phone broke my quiet, peaceful reverie. I walked over to the kitchen table and picked it up. It was a text message from Martha. The simple, brief message on the glowing screen made a small, genuine smile touch my lips. "Hi, Emily," the message read. "I know it is a very busy Saturday, but Richard and I were wondering if we could perhaps take Noah to the city park for just an hour this afternoon, only if you are completely comfortable with it, of course." I stared at the glowing phone, shaking my head slightly in quiet, utter disbelief. 6 months ago, she would have simply showed up at my front door, demanded access to my young child, and heavily criticised my parenting the entire terrible time. But the strict, unyielding boundaries I had drawn that dark night had completely, fundamentally changed our dynamic. They had quickly realised that I was entirely serious about my firm rules, and that my deep, profound need to protect my son was vastly stronger than their massive wealth. They'd started visiting exactly once a week for very short, highly supervised visits. The first few times the atmosphere was incredibly tense and deeply awkward. Richard had sat rigidly on the soft couch, entirely unsure of how to interact with a small, energetic child without simply ordering him around. Martha had constantly bitten her tongue, physically struggling to hold back her deeply ingrained critical comments. But slowly, over the passing months, the hard, bitter ice began to melt. They were learning how to be gentle, supportive grandparents instead of demanding, controlling dictators. They read silly, colourful books to Noah, they watched his favourite loud cartoons, and they brought him simple, inexpensive gifts, like a small box of crayons or a bright new puzzle. They were finally realising that his pure, unconditional love could never be bought with massive amounts of money or forced through cruel intimidation. It simply had to be gently, patiently earned. I typed out a quick, polite reply. "That sounds lovely, Martha. You can come by at 2:00. See you then." I put the cell phone down and walked back over to my happy, sticky son. The heavy, dark clouds of the past had finally cleared completely away. We were going to be okay. In fact, for the very first time in my entire life, I knew we were going to be absolutely incredibly wonderful. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, the front doorbell rang. It was a simple, polite chime, completely lacking the loud, demanding pounding that used to always signal their sudden arrivals. I walked slowly to the heavy wooden door, taking a deep, calming breath, and pulled it wide open. Richard and Martha stood quietly on the front porch. They were dressed casually in soft spring sweaters and comfortable walking shoes. They did not push past me into the grand foyer like they used to do. They stood perfectly still, respectfully, waiting for my explicit permission to enter our home. "Come on in," I said warmly, stepping back to give them plenty of space. "Thank you, Emily," Richard replied softly, carefully wiping his shoes on the welcome mat. Noah came running down the wooden stairs, his small sneakers thudding loudly against the carpeted steps. "Grandpa, Grandma," he yelled happily, launching himself into the bright hallway. In the past, Martha would have immediately scolded him for running indoors or for making entirely too much noise. But today, she simply dropped to her knees right on the hard, hardwood floor and opened her arms wide. "Hello, my sweet boy," she said, her voice full of genuine, gentle affection as she hugged him tightly. Richard smiled broadly, reaching into his deep coat pocket. He pulled out a simple, bright red rubber ball. It was not a highly expensive, flashy electronic toy designed to easily buy his quick love. It was just a regular, cheap rubber ball, completely perfect for a sunny afternoon. We walked together out through the glass patio doors into the warm green backyard. The bright spring sun felt incredibly good on my tired face. Richard and Noah ran out into the middle of the soft lawn, immediately starting a clumsy, laughing game of catch. I sat down on a comfortable patio chair, resting my hands quietly in my lap. Martha sat down slowly in the chair right next to me, holding a cold glass of sweet iced tea that I had poured for her. We sat in quiet, comfortable silence for several minutes, simply watching the two boys play. The loud, booming laugh of my father-in-law mixed beautifully with the high, sweet giggles of my young son. It was a perfectly ordinary, completely mundane family scene, but to me it felt like an absolute hard-won miracle. "He is getting so tall," Martha said softly, her eyes fixed entirely on Noah. "He looks more and more like Mark every single day. He really does. I agreed quietly, feeling a familiar soft ache in my chest, but no sharp, bitter pain. He has his exact same beautiful smile. Martha took a slow sip of her iced tea, the small ice cubes clinking gently against the smooth glass. I used to be so incredibly afraid of ordinary moments, exactly like this, she confessed, her voice barely above a quiet whisper. I always thought that if we were not doing something grand or highly impressive, we were completely failing. I spent my entire adult life chasing a perfect, flawless image, and I completely missed the actual beautiful reality of my own living family. I turned my head and looked closely at her. The harsh, bitter lines around her mouth had softened significantly over the last few months. She looked much older, certainly, but she also looked entirely, profoundly peaceful. "You are here right now, Martha," I said gently, offering her a small, forgiving smile. "That is the absolute only thing that truly matters to him today." She smiled back, a real, deeply honourable smile, and nodded her head slowly. "Thank you, Emily," she whispered softly, wiping a single happy tear from the corner of her wrinkled eye. "Thank you so much for teaching us how to finally just be a real family." We spent the next hour completely enjoying the beautiful warm weather. When the promised hour was completely up, Richard and Martha did not try to push the strict boundary or beg for more extra time. Richard patted Noah gently on the head, promising to play catch again next weekend. Martha gave him one last tight hug and thanked me politely for the delicious cold tea. They walked back through the quiet house, waved warmly from the front porch, and drove quietly away down the suburban street. I stood alone in the bright sunny doorway, watching their car disappear around the corner. I closed the heavy door, locking it out of simple daily habit, not out of deep, terrifying fear. I walked back into the bright living room, feeling a profound, immense sense of total contentment washing completely over my tired body. I thought about the dark, terrible week of the sad funeral. I thought about the shattered porcelain vase, the cold, cruel slaps of painful reality, and the shocking reading of the final legal will. It had been a massive, terrifying storm that had completely threatened to destroy us. But sometimes a deeply flawed, highly toxic system has to be entirely broken down before it can ever be rebuilt into something truly healthy. I had absolutely refused to carry the heavy, invisible burden of their massive pride any longer. I had bravely found my own voice, standing up to the cruel, powerful bullies who had tormented me for an entire decade. By setting firm, unyielding boundaries, I had not only protected my precious son, but I had actually saved his grandparents from their own terrible, isolating arrogance. I had successfully protected Mark's true emotional legacy. He wanted a safe family, built on genuine respect and quiet, unconditional love. And looking around my bright, peaceful home, listening to Noah humming happily in the kitchen, I knew I had finally entirely given that to him. I was no longer the frightened, invisible widow. I was a strong, fiercely protective mother. I was the proud architect of my own beautiful life, and I was finally entirely free. True family is built on mutual respect, not assumed authority or financial control. When we set firm, compassionate boundaries, we protect our peace and honour our self-worth. Love is shown by sharing emotional burdens, and sometimes letting systems break is the only way to rebuild them with genuine understanding.